there, sports fans. Welcome back to the channel. What in the world is Wayne doing today? Well, today we're going to take a little trip back in time to December of 2022 and January of 2023, when Dave and I were traveling through Peru. We crossed the border from Ecuador into Peru on December 3rd, and we started going down the northwest side of Peru, which is very deserty. It's all sand dunes and desert. But what we noticed was there was just a tremendous amount of garbage, as this clip will show you. Unfortunately, in northwestern Peru, this is all we've seen for the last 2 days. Piles and piles of garbage. But once we got away from the west coast of Peru and started heading into the mountains, it became gorgeous. We went to see the White Mountains. We saw all sorts of churches of different sizes and shapes and colors, and they were just gorgeous. We met some local people. We got our pictures taken in front of a statue on the coast. We went to one of the oldest civilizations in the world at Corral, and then we started heading to Lima, and about that time there was a coup attempt in Peru. The president of Peru, who was an indigenous person from the eastern part of Peru, was elected by the indigenous people, but he was a president who was for the people and not for the elite of Lima, not for the rich people of Lima. And the Congress in Peru tried to impeach him twice. They were getting ready to impeach him for a third time. And when they did, he took matters into his own hands and decided to overthrow the government. He wanted to disband Congress and take over the government, and he was immediately arrested and thrown in jail. Well, the indigenous people of eastern Peru were really upset with that, and they started protesting. Now, Dave and I were heading to Lima anyway. As I said, on December 3rd, we crossed the border. December 7th, the coup attempt took place. And we were heading to Lima so we could both fly home for the Christmas holidays. When we arrived in Lima, we had a really hard time finding our hotel or getting to our hotel because there were roadblocks everywhere. Our hotel happened to be very close to the presidential palace, so it was there was a huge security system in place where people couldn't get in there. Finally, we got to our hotel, and there was this huge police presence. There were no protests going on in Lima at that point. In fact, as you'll see from this next video, they had marches, they had cadets marching through Lima every day and every night, and really just kind of Lima was showing her strength and saying, you're not going to come to this town and protest. Let's give a listen. So we went home for the holidays, and then we arrived back in Lima on December 31st. And on January 1st, we started heading south. We were originally going to go to Cusco so we could see Machu Picchu, but we had heard reports that the protests were really bad there. They'd closed down the Cusco airport. There were lots of American and Canadian tourists that couldn't get out of Cusco. And they had damaged the railroad tracks going up to Aguas Calientes, which is the starting point for Machu Picchu. So we decided to skip that and to head south. We wanted to go down to Ica, which is this town south of Lima, because there's a kind of a famous oasis there called Huacachina. And it's this beautiful oasis set in the sand dunes. We stayed at a glamping spot that night, had a really nice meal, and the next morning we went off and rented some quads and rode through the dunes. Just had a blast. From Huacachina, we headed south and we wanted to see the Nazca lines. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Nazca lines are these lines that have been carved into the desert, and for a long time, people thought that these were done by aliens from space. They've since learned that these lines were done by the indigenous people that lived in this area a couple of thousand years ago. There's a couple of ways to see these lines. You can charter an airplane, you can fly over them, or you can simply climb one of the towers that's right along the Pan America Highway, which is what we decided to do, and it was just spectacular. So from Nazca, we headed down to a town on the coast called Camaná. Now keep in mind, up to this point, we have not seen a single protest. But that night we went out to dinner and we heard some chanting and shouting, and sure enough, there was our first protest. Very peaceful, but we saw our first protest. The next morning we headed up to Cañón del Coca, which is this very deep canyon, twice as deep as the Grand Canyon, and famous for its condors. And we were on our way to Puno and Lake Titicaca, and we asked the hostel owner where we stayed that night if there would be any protests on our way to Puno, and he said no. Well, guess what? We ran into our first protest and first roadblock just about 20 kilometers away. So this one was a fairly benign roadblock. There were a line of cars. We went to the front. There's a guy with some paint. He's painting something on the windshield of these vans. We presume it's just a sign that says they are good to go and can move forward. This guy's approaching us with a whip, and we noticed this in a lot of roadblocks. There were weapons, whips, and clubs. No guns, but whips and clubs. So we make it through this. We think, no problem. That was easy. And then we come to our second roadblock. And this one was quite a bit bigger. They've got the whole roadblock. They got fires going. And I'm just going to stop right now and let the dialogue take over. Okay. They just asked us to turn it off.
I think that if this goes on too long, we ought to just scoot down this little hill right here and then buzz across to that gravel. What you think?
Yeah, you think we can get around on that gravel?
Yeah, I think so. You suck up. You know, the guy said, let's hang all the gringos, and you applauded. Are Canadians gringos?
Yeah.
Oh, phew.
So that road's blocked. Completely.
Oh, yeah.
At this point, I see a guy walking over here, and I call him over, and I ask him how much longer it's going to be, and he says, oh, just a couple minutes when they get done speaking. And I said, wait, is it okay if we go down this side over here? And he shakes his head and says, yeah. The problem is he didn't tell anybody else. And watch as they start to whistle and yell at us when we go by. So we let out a sigh of relief, and we thought, oh, goodness, we've made it through another roadblock. Hopefully there's no more. But we did run into a third one, and this one really challenged us. So as I arrive at the roadblock, you can see that I get surrounded by a number of different protesters. What's interesting is these are old men, old women, young people, kids. These are all people, they're indigenous in the eastern part of Peru, and they're really unhappy with what's going on. Now this young guy approaches, and he's telling us, let's use the phones and use Google Translate. Even though I speak Spanish, I'm having a difficult time understanding what they're saying. We're going to do Google Translate. So you saw maybe something on the map back there? Tengo hotel de Puno. Necesito...
Aquí también, léelo. Mira hasta ahí.
No, entiendo, pero
¿qué se llama? Necesito... para que te vayas por mañana, ya le escribí.
Necesito... Voy a Puno.
Yeah, pero no...
So at this point she says, no, you can't go Puno this way, you have to go back around. And then the guy in the red jacket says the same thing, no, you got to go back around. Well, those roads were blocked behind us. Soy de Canada. Tengo hotel en Puno.
Le van a hacer hablar. ¿Dónde está hablando el señor?
¿Más protestas?
Protestas a favor de nosotros.
Okay.
Bájese de la moto, deje un rato su moto y va a hablar allá al público, a todos nos va a hablar.
Y de ahí te pasas
De ahí
con tu
te damos
moto.
pasada. Y speak English, no importa allá.
¿Cuándo?
Ahorita.
¿Cuántos minutos?
1 minuto o 2 nomás. Sí,
¿Pasó?
sí.
1, 2 minutos.
No, vas a dirigirte, vas a hablar.
Okay. No pasó.
No, después de eso pasas. Primero hablas
No debe
acá.
entender, ¿no?
Tu país es muy hermoso.
Ay, qué bonito. Thank you very much.
Tranquilo.
Yes.
It's gonna let us go? Okay.
No va a hablar.
¿Pasó?
Escribiendo, de repente va a gritar. ¿Sí?
Sí, yes.
Ajá, yes. Ok,
Sí, sí, por aquí.
ok.
Que pase nomás, dijo. ¿Querés su arenga? Ya, que pase nomás, dijo.
Espera.
¿Su compañero no habla español?
No entiendo.
No.
Dice.
Es,
Bájate un rato.
ok. Go now. Aquí.
Bájate un rato y te paras ahí.
I'm gonna go here. Let's see it working. Ah. ¿Está bien? Yeah.
So we finally get through that last roadblock and we make it to Puno. When we get to Puno, it's really dead there. Like there's nothing going on, but you can feel this sort of tension in the air. And the hotel said, you know, you can't leave your bikes outside. There's going to be some bad protests coming. You need to put your bikes in the lobby. So we parked in some unusual places on this trip, but never inside a hotel lobby. So our main reason for going to Puno is we wanted to visit the floating islands of Lake Titicaca. These are islands that are made of straw. The indigenous people hundreds of years ago built these islands as a way of being able to get away from their oppressors. They couldn't find a home on land, so they built these floating islands that they could simply float away if they were attacked. And while we're there, the guide was indigenous, and he was telling us that the next day there were going to be massive protests in Puno and Juliaca, which was a nearby town. And we had told him we wanted to leave the next day, and he said, you can't. All the roads are going to be blocked. You better stay put. And sure enough, all hell broke loose. So when I woke up that morning, I heard chanting and yelling and marching in the streets, and I went out to investigate. And thousands of people had descended upon the square, which was 1 block from our hotel. I started filming, and I went and watched them as they were marching into this square, and you can see they're swinging ropes and belts and whips. And one guy stops and points at me and says, "Stop recording." So I immediately stopped recording, but the gentleman in front of me, who was Peruvian, he got his phone knocked out of his hand. It was at that time I decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to our hotel. And as I was getting back to the hotel, they were blockading the doors. So they let me in and they say, you have to stay here all day. You cannot go outside. And what we learned is that day, 17 protesters were killed. They had tried to storm the airport, the international airport there, and the police shot and killed 17 of them. So we decided, you know what, it's time to get the heck out of town. We wanted to go to Bolivia and heading for La Paz, but we learned that that road was blocked. There was no way we could go. And then there were some other issues in Bolivia as well. So we decided to go to a town called Tacna on the Chile and Peru border and head into Chile. So we decided to leave early the next morning, and we're getting our bikes out of the lobby, and very quickly we realized we never could have gotten out of this town the day before. We run into our first sort of roadblock. There's a few people milling around, and the guy kind of waves at us to stop, but then he goes, "Oh, okay, go on ahead." It was a very lighthearted attempt. We wanted to get out early before they started building more roadblocks again. But as you will see, we go through kilometer after kilometer after kilometer of debris on the roadways. There was a burned out vehicle over on its side. There were dumpsters in the middle of the road. There were huge boulders and rocks that were put in the middle of the road. So it was really challenging to get out that day, but fortunately all of these roadblocks were unmanned at this time of day, and we were finally able to make our way out of Puno and arrive in Tacna later that day. So we had a little bit of trouble getting into Tacna. There were a couple of blockades where they had strung wire and ropes across the streets, and so we had to take a roundabout way to finally get to our hotel. We got to our hotel, had a nice meal. Next morning we get up to leave, And the hotel manager comes running out and says, "You can't go, look." And he points over by the airport, and there's this huge plume of black smoke. And he said, "No, they've blocked the Pan America Highway right at the airport. You can't leave." So we pulled out our maps and we said, "Well, could we take this route and go this way?" And he said, "Well, you could give that a try." So we did. And we ran into a number of roadblocks. We talked to a number of protesters, and then we came upon these guys. So Dave starts chatting with this guy, and he's telling him, "We are tourists. We just want to get to the frontera, which is the border with Chile." Then the boss comes over. He's kind of the head guy, and he starts pointing which direction we need to go to get out of there. He comes over and shakes my hand, and then he tells me, he points at his eyes, he said, "Just keep a lookout, be aware of what's going on." And then they want to take our photos. Here we are, these big bikes, and they want to take our photos. We finally get through that roadblock, and we make it to the border. It was a very easy border crossing, and we let out this big sigh of relief. Whew, we're done with the protests. So that was it. But before I end this video, I just want to recap everything that happened. We entered Peru. There was a coup attempt. The protesters got really mad. But we made it through. And how did we make it through without causing any harm to ourselves? Well, I think it's two things. Number one, we spoke the language. We were able to communicate with them on who we were, where we were going, what we were doing. And I always use the phrase, "Tu país es muy hermoso." Your country is very beautiful. And people would relax as soon as I would say that. The other thing is we were respectful and we were kind and we didn't get agitated. And I think those two things helped us get through these roadblocks. So if you enjoyed this video, please give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you on the next ride. Ciao.